Thank you, Juana. The next topic, verification. It's a very important topic. I'm glad we're taking a moment to introduce the families to this specific topic because it may not immediately impact them as they initially complete the FAFSA their first year, but somewhere along the line, they may encounter verification. And when people hear verification, they tend to freeze up. And it can be a little alarming when you first hear of, but it's really not anything to be afraid of. Being selected for verification is, in essence, it can happen two ways. The U.S. Department of Education could select your record for verification. As Soretta mentioned earlier, on average, 30 to 35% of all FAFSA submitted within a school year are submitted to go through the verification process. But also, the school has the ability to select a record for verification if there's inconsistencies and things along that line related to information that they've gathered in working with the family. So next slide, please. So if you are selected for verification, you must verify the information that is listed on your FAFSA. Verification is not optional. Once you've been selected, you are selected, and you must complete the process in order for the financial aid office of the school you are attending or planning to attend, in order for them to be able to determine your eligibility to receive financial aid. And let me just take a moment to say, when it comes to financial aid, the FAFSA itself is a federal document. However, the FAFSA, it's not uncommon for the FAFSA information or the expected family contribution from the FAFSA to also be used to determine a student's eligibility for institutional, which would be school financial assistance, as well as some state assistance, and also maybe for some private scholarships if you're applying for private scholarships. So the FAFSA can, even though it's a federal document, can have an impact on just financial aid across the board. So going back to verification. Verification itself, one way that potentially minimize the chances of being selected for verification is to use the ISA or the data retrieval tool that is part of the FAFSA application itself. As you're completing the FAFSA and answering questions in the financial section related to the student and the parent, you'll be given the option to use the data retrieval tool. And in essence, what that does, you're giving the FAFSA system authorization to connect with your record in the IRS's database. And if the data retrieval tool, or DRT as we like to say, is made available to you and you go through that process, it takes a little of the work off of you, because once you connect to your federal tax return or federal tax information in IRS's database, it will automatically pull your information in from your tax return to your FAFSA. And in doing that, as long as you don't change the information once you've pulled it over from your tax return to your FAFSA, it minimizes the chances of you being selected for verification, because the U.S. Department of Education's FAFSA database knows that that information was pulled directly from a confirmed source and that it's already been verified by the IRS. So if you're given the ability to use the data retrieval tool, use it. Please use it. And then also in regards to verification, it minimizes or reduces the chances of you being selected for verification. I'd just like to say, with the Department of Education, it's a random selection process. But in my personal experience of working with families, you could be selected once, you could be selected every year, or you could be not selected at all. I can't really explain to you how that works, but it does happen. It is a random process that the Department of Education completes. Keep that in mind. And like I said, don't be alarmed if you are in fact selected for verification. Kind of going back to what I was saying a moment ago, if you are notified that you've been selected for verification, it's not optional. It needs to be done. So don't put it on the back burner. Go ahead and immediately start working on it to understand what the financial aid office is requesting from you. For the verification process to be completed. And if you don't understand, don't hesitate to reach out to the office, the financial aid office that is, to get clarification in regards to what's needed, to be sure that you submit the needed documentation to them or information to them in a timely manner to not prohibit them from being able to determine what financial assistance you're able to receive. When turning in documents, be as thorough as possible with your answers. Exactly. If it's a form that they send to you, for example, some schools use what's called a verification form. You need to be as thorough as possible when responding to the answer or to the questions that have been asked of you on the forms and documents that the school sends to you related to the verification process. Being vague is not going to help you. Rushing through and not being thorough with your responses will only slow down the process. So you want to be as thorough as possible and be sure to provide all information and documentation that is requested of you to once again get through the verification process as quickly as possible. And again, if you're confused, if you just have general questions, you may think that you fully understand, but if there's ever a need for you to reach out or have a question, please don't hesitate to do so. A financial aid office, that's what those professionals are there for, and they will welcome your contact with them because they'd be more than happy to explain whatever your question or respond to whatever your questions may be and to explain whatever is needed. And keep in mind that last bullet point is very important. Your financial aid process is on hold until the verification process is completed or satisfied. Like I said, it's not going to disappear. It's not going to go away. If you are selected for verification, it's something that needs to be completed as soon as possible and not later, because the later you wait, the more stressful it becomes, the more difficult it becomes, especially mentally. So you want to do it as soon as possible once you've been notified that you've been selected for verification. All right, we've come to want to pause for questions and answers. As my colleagues have mentioned, if you have questions, please send those through the chat box so that we can respond to those. But I'll just kind of kick it off. And if my colleagues have anything that they want to share, please feel free to do so. The first bullet point, what questions do attendees have about options to pay and for verification? In regards to options to pay, unless you have saved up personal wealth where you're able to afford to pay to go to college out of pocket or through those resources that you've amounted or saved, the FAFSA is going to be the most important tool for you. Going back to what I said earlier, not only does it impact determining eligibility for federal aid, but it could also potentially impact if you're an in-state student, no kind of student, institutional grants and scholarships. A lot of that is tied to your FAFSA being fully completed and you having an EFC. Once again, if you're selected for verification, that verification process being completed. So that's going to be your most important tool. And that's the most important tool for a large percentage of students and families when they're looking to go to college. Don't think I mentioned this earlier, but the FAFSA does need to be completed each year. So be sure that you do that. It becomes available October 1st of the previous school year. So for example, the 21-22 school year that's going to start in August, that FAFSA became available on October 1st, 2020. So it's something that you want to keep on your calendar or have on your radar to get done as soon as possible so that you can get through that process. And if by chance you are selected for verification, you can get through that process as well. Second part of that, let me see what happens when a student does not follow through. As we've said, if you don't follow through with verification, it's going to be it's virtually impossible for the financial aid office to determine your eligibility, to give you a full determination of your eligibility. There may be some financial aid, for example, there may be a merit-based scholarship that's based on your high school performance, or if you're an athlete, something along that line, if you get an athletic scholarship. So there's some financial assistance that's not tied to the FAFSA, but for the vast majority of it, it is tied to the FAFSA. So you want to be sure that you are doing what you need to do. And once again, if you're selected for verification, get through that process as quickly as possible. What type of documents are usually requested during the verification process? I mentioned the verification worksheet. It's not used by all schools, but it's used by many, if not most, because they use that particular document to get information related to household members. If you think on the FAFSA, it does ask about the number of household members, the number of in college. They may also try to capture any other household related financial resources that aren't captured by the FAFSA. So it could be a verification worksheet. Proof of income. If you have income outside of your normal job, they may want to know about that. Not everyone files a federal tax return, so it may be necessary for you to provide some other type of documentation that provides proof of what your income is. Like a question on the FAFSA, they want to know how many students are in or individuals in the household are attending college during that specific school year. So it's possible that the school could request documentation. Let's say, for example, if your student is applying to go to school A and you have another at school B, school A is completing the verification process, they may request proof that you actually have another student at school B that is attending school. So you may have to submit a copy of that student's enrollment confirmation, for example. Then there's other supporting documentation. It can vary from family to family, just depending on what information you've reported on the FAFSA, what other resources you may have that you've reported on the FAFSA, and or any other documents that you've submitted to the financial aid. But that's generally what you will see. The schools are going to require. Oh, last but not least, I don't know how I almost forgot this. If you did not use the data retrieval tool, the school may request that you submit a copy of your federal tax return, signed federal tax return, and or a copy of your federal tax transcript. But in general, those are typically the most common documents that families have to submit when they are selected for verification. Not seeing any questions in the chat box. Colleagues, please let me know if I'm missing something.
Nope, I haven't seen any yet. If anyone has questions, feel free to shoot them over. And in the meantime, we'll just keep going and have Ms. Soretta talk about some loan information. Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you.
So let's talk student loans. That's a hot topic. I know borrowing money is not always a very popular topic, but because college costs increase with inflation, it's sometimes necessary for us to borrow some of the monies to help pay for our college expenses. So let's get right to it. Knowing your rights and responsibilities and understanding is key. So we already know loans have to be repaid. So whatever we borrow, we have to pay back, which is why we only encourage you to borrow what you absolutely need to help and assist with paying for college, not for other things that we want to purchase, but to pay for our educational expenses. Interest, when we borrow money, we have to pay back more than what we've borrowed. So we're charged to borrow someone else's money, and you're going to be borrowing money typically through the federal government, the William D. Ford Federal Direct Loan Program, which I'll talk about in just a few moments. But we got to pay the government back a little bit more than what we borrow, because that's our appreciation, with lack of a better word, of what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to pay it back with interest. Also, capitalization. Capitalization, as it reads here, the addition of unpaid interest to the principal balance. So while we are using their money, interest is accruing through the years. So whatever we don't pay back in interest while we're actually, before that loan goes into repayment, it's going to be added to the principal amount that we originally borrowed. So in essence, we'll be paying interest on top of interest if it's capitalized. And then we continue to pay interest on the monies that was capitalized, as I said before, interest on top of interest, the principal that we borrow. Now we're going to be charged interest through the years of paying the monies back as well. So we want you to understand what's actually going on, so there are no surprises. Okay. So you have two different types of student loans. We talked very briefly about the subsidized, federal subsidized direct Stafford, federal subsidized Stafford loan. That's a need-based loan. We talked about that earlier when we were talking about need-based funds. So that federal subsidized loan is a loan that we could receive after we've completed that FAFSA form, and it's determined based upon our income and assets, what we're expected to be able to contribute to our loved one's education, that we show some need. So if you're eligible for that subsidized loan, the government will pay the interest for you while you're enrolled in school during your grace period. And if you decide to continue your education beyond your undergraduate studies, they would, and you're enrolled in school at least half time. That's key, being enrolled in school at least half time. The government will continue to pay that interest. So repayment typically begins 6 months after you graduate or no longer enrolled in school. With that being said, students have to be very careful when dropping classes. They need to make sure they don't drop a number of classes to put them in a classification for less than half-time enrollment. You have to be enrolled in school at least half-time to eliminate those loans from going into repayment. We also have the federal unsubsidized direct Stafford loan under the William D. Ford Federal Direct Loan Program. And that's a non-need-based loan for students who don't show need. You can still borrow money to assist with paying for college. You're not required to demonstrate financial need. The interest is going to accrue, of course, on that loan. The government's not going to pay for the interest on the unsubsidized loan. That loan does not go into repayment either until 6 months after you graduate or drop below half time. With the unsubsidized loan, you're not required to pay the interest, even though it is accumulating while you're enrolled in school. But you can, it's optional. You can pay the interest, or you can just allow it to accrue. And then back to what we just talked about, capitalize and be added on to the principal amount in which you originally borrowed. Okay. So there are loan limits that have been set based upon your grade level. A first-year undergraduate, that is a freshman in college, the maximum subsidized monies they can borrow is $3,500 per academic year. And they can get up to $2,000 in the unsubsidized loan category. The annual amount they can borrow within that fiscal year is $5,500. Second year undergraduate, which is a sophomore in college, maximum subsidized is $4,500. Maximum unsubsidized is $2,000. The annual amount in which they can borrow is $6,500. A third and fourth year undergraduate student, which is a junior in college or a senior in college, the maximum subsidized monies they can borrow is $5,500. The maximum unsubsidized monies is $2,000, and the annual loan limit for a junior or senior in college is $7,500. They set loan limits because they don't want students to be bombarded with a great deal of debt once they graduate from college. Let's talk about that last paragraph in this particular slide. The aggregate limit for undergraduate dependent students is $31,000, with no more than $23,000 borrowed from the subsidized loan program. You can never borrow more than your cost of attendance minus any other financial aid you'll get. So you may receive less than the annual maximum amounts. Again, the federal government is trying to keep down the amount of money in which you will have to pay back once you graduate. So that is the reason why these aggregate limits have been set. Okay. Loan limits for dependent students not eligible for subsidized monies. First year undergraduate, which is a freshman again, a maximum unsubsidized of $5,500, and that's the maximum they can receive within that academic year. A second year undergraduate, which is a sophomore, we're talking about dependent students, $6,500, unsubsidized, $6,500 maximum annual limit. These are students who are not eligible for subsidized. Third and fourth year, junior and senior, maximum $7,500 with a maximum of $7,500 for that annual year. Now, the aggregate limit for undergraduate dependent students is $31,000. Again, you cannot borrow more than your cost of attendance minus any other aid that you'll be offered. So you may receive less than the annual maximum amounts. Okay. So loan limits for dependent and independent students whose parents are denied the PLUS loan. There was we didn't talk about any credit check for our dependent and independent students, but with the parents who will be participating in the PLUS loan program, there will be a credit check, and it's looking at debt to income ratio or derogatory credit. So let's say the parents were going to borrow money to assist with their child going back to college, but they were denied for whatever reason. So it allows that student now to be eligible for additional monies because their parent, was denied the Parent Plus loan. So let's talk about this chart again. First year undergraduate freshman, maximum subsidized $3,500, unsubsidized $6,000 with a maximum annual limit of $9,500. Second year undergraduate, which is a sophomore, $4,500 subsidized, $6,000 unsubsidized with a maximum annual limit of $10,500. Third and fourth year undergraduate, $5,500 subsidized, $7,000 unsubsidized with a maximum annual limit of $12,500. Graduate or professional, not eligible for the subsidized loan, but they are eligible for unsubsidized monies up to $20,500 with an annual limit of that same amount, $20,500. Now, this is going to be a little bit different. The aggregate limit for undergraduate students whose parents were denied the PLUS is $57,500 with no more than $23,000 in subsidized loans. So the aggregate limit for a graduate professional student is $138,500 with no more than $65,000 in subsidized loans. Okay. So we have different types of student loans. Grad Plus, you may have heard. That's a graduate student or professional student. They must, of course, complete the free application for federal student aid and have a signed master promissory note. And that is the process of getting that loan. That FAFSA form has to be on file, and they have to complete a loan application referred to as a master promissory note. Repayment can be deferred while that graduate student is in school. A Direct Plus loan for parents. Sometimes parents don't want their kids to be in debt, or they only want them to borrow the maximum amount in which they're eligible for as an undergraduate student in the subsidized or unsubsidized program. They've been approved for the credit. So they say, well, okay, well, I'm going to borrow the difference. So that is that money is monies that parent has borrowed on behalf of their dependent son or daughter who's in undergraduate school. The parent borrower must not have an adverse credit. As I said earlier, history credit check will be done. If the parent does not pass the credit check, the parent may still receive a loan if someone, such as a relative or a friend who is able to pass the credit check, agrees to endorse the loan. So they're going to need a co-signer. Alternative or private loans. You have to be very careful with our alternative and private loans because of the interest rate or going into repayment right away. So the student or the parent should only borrow what they absolutely need with this particular program. So we definitely want you to consider North Carolina's nonprofit lender, College Foundation Incorporated, for alternative loans. College Foundation offers a North Carolina Parent Assist as well as a North Carolina Student Assist loan. You can visit ncassist.org for more detailed information, but we are going to talk about that loan program this evening. Okay.
Right.
I'm now going to turn this over to, I do believe, Dr. Query, who is now going to talk about the North Carolina Student Assist loan.
Thank you, Soretta. And it is really important for us to talk about these options because, as you guys just saw when Soretta was explaining the loan limits, it's hard for a student who's just borrowing federal loans for undergraduate school to get into a serious, a serious amount of debt because there is that aggregate limit there. We find students tend to get in trouble with student loans who have started working on an undergraduate degree and borrowed a good amount and then never graduated, and so perhaps haven't found the job to make the income to be able to make those payments, as well as graduate school, and then parents borrowing. So for a lot of reasons with undergraduate, students may decide to borrow with the federal government because there's more repayment options. If they're interested in public service loan forgiveness, they're going to have to stick with the federal direct loans for that. But sometimes students have to borrow a little bit more than what they are able to with an undergraduate degree. And so that's when they want to start shopping around to figure out what direction they want to go to borrow more. And then also, if parents are going to have to borrow, it's really important to shop around because there isn't a whole lot of benefits. Really, there aren't any benefits at all for parents with the federal direct loans. I mean, you're just kind of borrowing and you've got to start paying it back right away. And so parents definitely want to shop around. And then students, if you're thinking about graduate school and you may have to borrow an alternative loan, you want to really shop around for that too. So we want to make sure that families understand that in North Carolina, we have College Foundation, which is our state-based nonprofit. And so the goal with your state-based nonprofit is to just provide you with an option to borrow at the lowest rate possible. The goal is not to make money. The goal is to just provide students funding for that gap to help pay for school. And we do mean that gap. So we hope students and families aren't borrowing large amounts, of alternative loans or whatever it might be to pay for everything. This should be part of your financial aid package, which is why we started the presentation talking about the financial aid and making sure that everyone understood some basics on the front end. So hopefully this is a combination of filling out your FAFSA form and getting some free money for school, and and so you have your whole financial aid package. So that said, we have two options with North Carolina. We have the student assist and the parent assist. So this is the student assist information. And as you saw on the last slide, if you go to ncassist.org, you'll find everything there. So I'm not going to go too deep into this. I just want to make sure everyone had a couple of snippets here. So with the student and the parent assist, there's no application, original or origination or prepayment fees ever. Your interest rate's 5.25. When you're in auto draft repayment, it gives you 1/4% reduction. And that's the interest rate for everyone. It's not like apply and then we'll see what kind of money you make and we'll see what your, credit scores, and then we'll give you an interest rate. That's just your interest rate. It's very clear and upfront. Here's your minimum and maximums for borrowing. The student does have to be at least 17 years of age, and they have to either be a North Carolina resident or attending a school in North Carolina. So you have to have that North Carolina connection. Credit worthiness is a 700 credit score, just FYI. And then you have to be a US citizen or eligible non-citizen. If the student doesn't meet those requirements, which of course it's hard for a lot of students to meet those requirements, they do have to have a cosigner. And so here are the requirements for a cosigner. You have to be at least 21 years of age. You have to be a spouse or a relative of the student who is going to school, US citizen, and then also have that credit score of 700 to be that credit worthy. Okay, and so that's that for the student one. Now for the parent one, it's a lot of the same things. The main difference is the interest rate. So it's a 4.5 interest rate when an auto draft repayment. Here are your borrowing limits. Again, there's no fees, and you can borrow up to your college's cost of attendance minus other aid. So those rules that Ms. Soretta talked about earlier with the federal education loans, it's the same. You can never borrow more than your college's cost of attendance. And of course, there's no prepayment penalty. And then those requirements to be a parent borrower, you have to be the biological, adoptive parent, or step parent of an eligible benefiting student. And then again, a US citizen or eligible non-citizen, a North Carolina resident, or have a student who's attending a school in North Carolina. And again, it's the same credit score. And then if for some reason the parent has any other, old CFI loans, you just have to be in good standing with those. So we just wanted to take a moment and pause for Q&A, and then we're going to jump into special circumstances with WANA. So I'm just going to read a couple of these questions and see if any of the colleagues want to jump in. And then if anyone who's on wants to send over any questions in the chat, you're welcome to. So how does the family get the loan process started? I'll jump into this one. So the whole loan process starts with doing your FAFSA form. You always want to start with your FAFSA form. As Sean said earlier, that is the bulk of the financial aid process. First, you want to see what sort of free money you're going to get first, right, before you borrow. But that is the entire process. And as you get those offer letters, as Juana showed you earlier, sometimes the institution may go ahead and offer you a loan, especially an education loan. A federal education loan, they may go ahead and offer you one up front. You can accept all, part, or none. If you accept all of it and you need more, that's when the alternative loan process starts. And so you'll know if you need more because, right, you have a bill to pay to the institution and perhaps you just don't have that right to give it to them. And so you're going to have to borrow a little bit more. And so you can communicate with the financial aid office at your institution and say, I understand we need to borrow a little bit more. I understand there's a state-based nonprofit, or if there's someone else you want to go with. And so the key to this is communicating with your financial aid office. But really, you're just going to start with a FAFSA form, and then you'll see your offer letter, and then you'll communicate with the financial aid office. Next question: if families have to borrow up front, can they borrow mid-semester? And the answer is yes, they can borrow up front. They can borrow mid-semester. So that's a common question on that offer letter. If you are offered some loan money and you think, I think we need all of this, perhaps just part of it, you can accept just part of it. And then if you get midway through the semester and realize you need some more money, your students spilled their coffee on their laptop in the middle of the night when they were trying to write their paper last minute. And so now you're going to have another big expense. So just communicate with the financial aid office and you can borrow mid-semester. And just like I said at the beginning, you can borrow part of what you have been offered or all of it or none of it. Another really common question that we get is, can students borrow education loans if parents still owe? And the answer is yes. So hopefully that may relax some parents listening to this. Many times we'll have parents say, gosh, I still owe money. Can my students borrow? And they absolutely can. This is their debt, not yours. So they're going to start kind of on their own for that. And parents, I've also been asked before, parents perhaps have been in default with a student loan and you're wondering, can my students borrow? And the answer is yes. Parents, you can't borrow anymore if you're in default, so you can't borrow like the Parent Plus loan or anything with the federal government. But your students can definitely still borrow. This is separate. This is their debt. This is their student loan. So keep that in mind. They are separate. And so that answers the second one. And then when would you borrow an alternative loan, before or after a federal loan? We did mention, or I did mention that a few moments ago. A lot of students do want to start with a federal loan because there are so many different repayment plans. And then if you try to go into the public service loan forgiveness, you have to be a federal education loan for that. So a lot of families will start there. And then if you have to borrow more than what that aggregate limit was that Soretta showed you, that's when you may go to an alternative loan. If parents are borrowing, you definitely want to shop around. And if you are considering graduate school, you may also want to shop around as well. So when does a parent have to start paying back their loan? Pretty much right away. So just keep in mind that when your students in their first year of college, you're going to start receiving a bill. And you can always communicate with the college or whoever your lender is to make sure you know when it's coming and when you're going to have to get started with that. Did any of my colleagues have anything else they wanted to add before we move on to special circumstances?
I think you about covered it.
Great. Okay. And I do have a couple more slides I meant to go over. I'm so sorry, before I pass it back over to Juana. Just a couple of basics. We talked a little bit about, I mentioned the parents not having a deferment. So let's just talk about what those terms are very quickly. A grace period is a time during which you don't have to make any loan payment. So parents are not going to get a grace period. This is just for students. And so the grace period happens 6 months after you graduate from college or are no longer enrolled, at least part-time. And so you will have interest accruing during that 6 months time, but you won't have to make any payment. So the idea with that is it perhaps gives the student time to find a job, right? Fingers crossed, before you start making those payments back. A deferment is a time during which loan payments are temporarily suspended. And so there's different deferments that you may apply for, and you have to communicate with whoever your lender is for your education loans. You just have to communicate. But an example of a deferment is an in-school deferment. So if your student graduates from undergrad and decides to go to graduate school, their loans will be put into an in-school deferment. So interest may accrue depending on what type of loan they have, but they won't have any payments due because it'll be deferred until they're not in school anymore. Okay. And then forbearance. This is a temporary change in loan payment due to some financial hardship you may be experiencing. So the key to all of this is communicate, communicate, communicate. So whoever your lender is, if a student or a parent finds yourself in a situation where you've got heavy medical expenses, or you've lost your job, or you've been demoted, and you're having some sort of financial hardship, you've got to make sure you communicate with your lender and let them know. But you are able to contact them and talk about your situation and find out where you are with this. So communicate, communicate, communicate. And if you ever have any trouble paying, contact your direct loan servicer, contact your lender, whoever that might be. The idea of a servicer is really important here because the federal government, the way I like to explain this is the federal government has so much loan volume, right? They have so many folks that are borrowing from them. They don't necessarily perhaps have the staff to service all of their borrowers. And so they have certain companies and organizations that they work with who is your loan servicer, okay? And what that means is they're kind of like the go-between. They're the person that you're going to communicate with if you have questions, or the person that you're going to apply for that forbearance with or deferment, and they're the people you're going to make payments to. So you've just got to make sure that you communicate. There are possibly options to reduce your monthly payment or temporarily postpone payments, but you've just got to make sure that you let them know what's going on. So as we said before, if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them over in the chat box. And I'm actually going to pass this over back over to Soretta Broadway to talk a little bit about special circumstances.